Thank you, Professor Elliott. We are ready to get started.
Okay. My name is Michael Elliott. I have been teaching history and theory of planning for what might be considered a historical epic, 40 years now. And so what we're going to be doing today is going quite quickly through kind of some basic ideas around history and theory. Let me share my screen, and then we can continue. Um, so, okay. So the question is, are people seeing the screen appropriately?
Yes, we can see
Okay.
it. Thank you.
Okay. So history and theories of planning. Essentially the question is, why do we do what we do today? The practice of today is built on both the practice and the reflections on those practices, which we call theory. That has, that emerged over the last 150 years. And what we're going to do today is study it at the speed of 3 years per minute. Obviously, this is not an in-depth look, but an attempt to try to make sense of the bigger picture, and what the kind of set of ideas are. We're going to do this by first looking at the relationship between history and theory. What does theory have to do with history or practice, and vice versa? We're going to look at historic epics, the kind of emergence of planning, utopianism, efforts to codify the professional planning practice, to look at the first kind of real theory in planning, which was called rational planning. Synoptic or comprehensive planning is particularly because rational planning evolves over time, and the challenges and responses to that. We're going to look at communicative planning, political action, and pragmatism as kind of three other sets of theories. And then a little bit more on the history part, and end by looking at core values, and then some suggestions of supplemental resources to help you prepare. The first section is relationship between history and theory and planning. What we have is, and I'm going to move my camera. I have my camera right in front of my screen, so I'm going to move it off to the side. So what we have is the a relationship between history and theory. And to understand current practice, we have to look at both. So planning history provides kind of insights around current planning, because planning emerged out as an applied discipline. It didn't start with theory. It started with people trying to solve problems, right? And there were social conditions and practices that were used over time. And those were developed, and they were codified as professional activity and largely taught, at least at the beginning, to other practitioners via apprenticeships. It wasn't even in a university setting, right? So in this context, practices evolving, emerging and evolving, and ideas of what constitutes planning practice are pretty substantially set before planners start to think much more critically about the practice that they actually engage in. So the theories are emerge after that over time to provide insights into these processes and the practices of the underlying profession. So the theories look at things like, well, how do cities and regions actually work? And what do we have to know about them to get them to work? And how is planning actually conducted? And if in fact we want planning to activate and engage certain core functions and values, how do we do that? Um, so that theories learn and also inform practice. We can think about this as planning as kind of linking goals and knowledge to action. So it's a process. It's a set of procedures. It's a set of methods. for doing a number of things. For one, setting goals. What should we be trying to accomplish? Identifying and assessing those options. What are our best choices? And for developing strategies for achieving those desired ends. It's also something that's not restricted to planners, because planning as an activity is a basic human activity. It kind of embedded in anything we do that's future oriented and decision making oriented. So we have to somehow be able to relate goals and knowledge to a process, which we call planning, to actions. So what are the functions of planning? Well, there's been identified a number of different functions, but generally four types of functions, right? One of them is to basically improve the efficiency of outcomes. We're going to invest in a transportation system. We have a certain amount of money. What's the best system we could build under that? So it's an optimization process, right? The second kind of set of functions or goals is we seek to enhance social welfare. We think about balancing interest. We think about engaging justice as kind of the actions that are associated with that. The third major goal or function is to widen the range of choice, the options, to make it possible for people to have choices, right? And to understand the implications of their choices and to engage in kind of creating a future. So we create visions, which is largely a design function. We seek to enhance options. And then we also seek to enhance and enrich civic engagement, the role of the citizen, the citizen in the decision-making processes themselves and in governance. So expanding opportunity, understanding of these particular processes. I'm going to try to, I wonder if there's a way to get rid of this. You can't minimize this, right? So you're all seeing this bar down here, right? Let me see if I can, I don't really think there's any place I can move it to. Okay, well, we're stuck with it. So the core functions then are to assess and analyze. We have to know how to engage. We have to know how to envision and design. We have to be able to synthesize, and we have to be able to implement, all of which are part of the planning procedures, all of which requires different skills and balancing that there is an emphasis on one or the other of these core functions as we move through the process. So in this context, we have kind of the question of where does planning theory come from? So planning emerges. Oops, did I go backwards? So we have the types of theories, and we can think about types of theories in a number of different ways. So one is we have normative theories. And normative theories are answers the question, to what ends ought planning to be focused? And the normative theories come from theories of the public good, theories of social justice, utilitarianism, rights-based kind of theories, those kinds of theories. We have disciplinary theories. These are theories that are to tell us how cities and regions work, and by how we do assessments, how we project, those kinds of things. And to that, we look to economics, geography, environmental science, and a whole host of other disciplinary fields. And then the third is what we might call procedural or process theories. And the issue is how might planners act? We draw from decision theory, political science, negotiation theory, public participation. And then all of that together then leads to this relationship between goals, knowledge, planning, and action. Okay, so what we're largely going to be focusing on today is the kind of procedural process theories, what we have here as labeled as planning. Okay, so let's back up a little bit and ask the question of where planning comes to the United States and what's its initial forms, right? So we start with colonial planning, Uh, Colonial planning was largely focused on urban design and street systems. There were a number of rather creative kind of choices or options developed. To my way of thinking, this is Savannah Ward Park system. The Oglethorpe's processes were, in fact, quite innovative, and in the sense that it was modular and allowed for a modular expansion of the city. Took into account that it was going to start small and then grow, and created not just the modules, but some way of creating a hierarchy in which kind of some broader street structures, as you see down in here, become commercial centers. But also you have squares that are different sizes and things like that, with the functions of the government being closest to the square, and civic functions and other functions being spread out against it. But there's other models as well, the Philadelphia model with the grid and park system, and the Annapolis, and then later Washington, D.C., this kind of radiocentric kind of systems that were put in place. But they're largely designed to make possible the building of cities and new cities on virgin land. So at the national level, it's the early U.S. planning, and the national level was about infrastructure. Two problems: the infrastructure development and the efforts to, in fact, populate the country. Now, obviously, the kind of initial, even 1785, just as the country is being formed, is the first public lands ordinance, and how to, in fact, in essence, privatize large amounts of land. The Erie Canal, 1825, the Homestead and Morrill Acts, also about kind of getting people to homestead and occupy land. You don't see very much development of local planning beyond the urban design functions until you get into the mid to late 1800s. And an early example would be the 1879 Old New York City's tenement housing law, which tried to deal with overcrowding. So the other piece that you see, as you go into the 1800s, the wave of kind of socially engineered communities. These are communities that were designed and developed in order to, in some ways, uplift humans. The ideas of how to do that were, of course, embedded in the design. They tended to be associated with industrial towns. So Pullman, for instance, George Pullman was a manufacturer of the Pullman railroad cars, and built a industrial town outside of Chicago. And it not only had a physical design, but also had a significant amount of kind of social oriented rules. So no alcohol, for the most part. The only people who really could have alcohol in this area was in the gentlemen's club. So you still had exceptions, but nonetheless, efforts to get out of Chicago, which is heavily polluted, efforts to create a kind of orderly local government. Riverside would be another example, not industrially based, but Olmsted and Val having a significant part in kind of thinking through what a model suburb might look like. There is then the emergence of what we might call the early planning movements, and there are a number of different planning movements. The distinctions between these is, they're facing conditions that as cities expanded quite rapidly in the United States during these periods of time, the United States went from an agrarian society in which most people lived in rural areas to an urban society. The transition was around 1920, where more than 50% of the people lived in urban places. And so during this period of time, these cities are growing quite rapidly. And there are problems of pollution, overcrowded, disease, any number of problems, which people are trying to solve. And they're trying to solve it in this continuum on the left. There's a number of people who are trying to solve it largely by fixing the physical environment. The idea was that if you had a good physical environment, the people living there would do fine. On the other end was those that were focused much more on social issues. They said basically social issues like education, economics, opportunity, those kinds of things. That fundamentally, if you educated people and you gave them opportunities, then the cities would be fine as well. So there's these different kinds of emphases. And what do these movements look like? Well, the first of these was the Parks movement. So the Parks movement kind of suggesting that the way to improve the human condition was to provide a connection between humans and nature, and to therefore allow people to be in natural environments that would uplift them, right? It was seen as a way of reducing crowding, congestion. It was seen as a way of clean air and other kinds of issues like that. Another movement would be the sanitary reform and public health movement. We have, during this period of time, diseases that were killing substantial percentages of people who lived in cities. Memphis went through a forget if it was smallpox or which disease it was, but in which more than half the people left the city. And of those that stayed, it was about 20% of them died. So you have these real strong threats, and how did you deal with that? And here it's both education and the development of the nascent forms of infrastructure we had, for instance, to manage wastewater. The next is the settlement housing movement. So the settlement housing movement is related to immigrants moving into the city, and how did you in fact incorporate and engage the immigrants moving in who had not lived in these kinds of environments before and who may not even know English. The City Beautiful movement, which starts with the Chicago Exposition, the World's Fair. And you have Garden City, the Howard kind of approach to thinking about the scale of cities and the economic basis for cities and the kind of physical design of them. And then finally, you have this city efficient movement, which is related to the progressive movement. So all of these movements had significant impact on the development of planning, or the emergence of planning. Each of these coming from a different profession. So the Parks movement was largely people associated with what we would call landscape architecture now, Olmsted, Cleveland, Baxter, each creating these large regional systems as a way of moving forward. The public health and sanitary reform movement was emerging out of a lot of different problems. The slaughterhouses, for instance, that created so many problems in cities. The first land uses were, in fact, trying to separate those slaughterhouses out from residential areas. And then tenement controls and, as I mentioned, Memphis issues about how many people were dying in cities during the plagues, right? So a lot of that, the physical public health part of that, eventually becomes its own profession, which is the profession of public health. But at the beginning, there was no such distinctions between the public health profession and what we might think of as planning today. The settlement housing and reform movement, you see lots of different actors in this. the settlement houses themselves, like Jane Addams and Mary Simkovich, were efforts to provide a place where primarily immigrants could come and receive education, receive services, other kinds of supports for them. There was also, you look at the literature of the time, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards, which was probably one of it was in essence, a science fiction novel about looking at the 1980s and looking back over the previous century. But it clearly had a vision of a well-planned community solving significant numbers of problems having to do with the increase in population and density of cities in the United States. And then the kind of muckraking literature like Jacob Riis and his How the Other Half Lives and the Children of the Poor, creating a visual kind of representation of what some of the problems of these cities are. And so this is Jane Addams, in the settlement movement. It says the good we secure for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it's secured for all of us and incorporated into our common life. It's kind of the sentiment that was driving that. The City Beautiful movement, so you have the Columbian Exposition, which Olmsted is part of, but really Burnham is a more significant part of. You start to see the rise of, so Burnham is considered one of certainly the more important kind of actors in planning. He shows up in the same way that Olmsted does around parks. Burnham shows up around many of the civic plans of large cities in the United States. So you have the Columbian Exposition, this kind of the notion of the white city, and then a whole series of plans that emerge out of this idea. The idea was, of course, if you look at these pictures, the kind of formalism, which is really an import of European ideas of civic spaces into the United States. And it was the time, for instance, the first kind of major exposition that used electric light bulbs and things like that. So also kind of dealing with this kind of modernity of new technologies coupled to this architecture, which kind of beckons back into the European past and became pretty much the basis for how civic spaces got developed for a period of time after that. And so the most famous of these is, so the Macmillan Plan for Washington, D.C., but really the Chicago Plan is the one that has been most vibrant, and it is still taught in elementary schools in Chicago, which is, I believe, the only plan I know of that is taught in school and, for over 100 years. Okay, so we can, of course, look at Burnham, and he is particularly famous for saying, make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans, remembering that a noble logical diagram once recorded will never die, but long after we are gone will be a living thing asserting itself with ever-growing insistency. Let your watchword be order and your beacon beauty. It's remarkable, of course, that this statement is quite predictive of the work that he did in Chicago and that he did in Washington, D.C. And at the same time, you see the progressive movement as reform. So you have kind of a political and economic reaction against corporations and monopolies. You also have a reaction against the influence of what were considered to be corrupt ward bosses like Tammany Hall, which was based on the system of government we had in place, which dispersed power in cities amongst many individuals. So it was what we call the weak mayor form of government, and it made it possible for a significant amount of corruption without a whole lot of accountability. And so the other pressure at this time is, of course, elites, economic elites, are leaving the central city and moving to what were the early suburbs. So they were losing control of central cities, partially because immigrant populations were increasing, partially because they were leaving the cities themselves. And so that dislocation of economic and political power also drove the progressive movement. And then you have the emergence of corporate models of management that were coming out of the private sector, which tended to focus on strong executive leadership instead of dispersed power. And then the fourth major trend behind this was the kind of increasing rationalization and professionalization of city governance, and the emergence of civil service and the efforts to depoliticize cities, which is, of course, related to the idea that cities should be managed as if they were corporations. And so lots of structures emerge out of this. We'll get back to those structures. There's also a kind of increased focus on what we call utopianism, the idea that we ought to be able to create the good society through an intentional community, and that this almost always had a corollary, that you needed new social arrangements, new physical arrangements for this to be true. And so you see early planners proposing kind of very sweeping changes about how physical, social, and economic structures should be related to each other. The development of plans that are essentially imaginative visions that emerge out of moral philosophy. So these utopian visions were focused on the ends. They focused on what the desirable state was. They were not meant to be, and certainly did not provide much information about how to pragmatically meet those ends, what the means ought to be. And so we have this quote from Looking Backward, which I mentioned, which is, he says, when men came to realize that the change was not merely an improvement in the details of their condition, but the rise of the race to a new plane of existence, right? That essentially science and art and music and literary productiveness would, under the guidance of a kind of benevolent rationality, would in fact lead to a new era in human existence. So that's the idea. We see three major actors promoting different ideas. So we have Ebenezer Howard's Garden City movement, which suggested that cities should be limited to about 20,000 residents, offered a way of doing this, which was using this kind of radial city, in which you had the center largely being civic organizations, churches, government, parks. There being kind of a residential district, which included both those that were poor and those that were rich, with the rich living around the Grand Avenue and the poor living adjacent to them. And then industry largely being on the outside, in which railroads would have easy access to and would not have to penetrate into the cities. And after you filled up a 20,000 resident city, you would just simply create another city, another garden city. The idea was to connect the town to the country and create this by merging those two things, something that was much more dynamic. It says the town and country must be married, and out of this joyous union will spring a new hope, a new life, a new civilization. Important to note that this was not a physical solution by itself. There was community ownership of the land proposed, with public revenues based on rents rather than taxes. It was a social reform and an economic self-sufficiency reform. Very little of the social economic parts of this was ever implemented, but the physical parts did kind of lead to a whole a development of ideas. And you see this in places like Leechworth and Welland in England, and then the Greenbelt, Maryland in the United States, which was built by, there's a picture of that, which was built under the New Deal during the Depression. Of note, that this is all, like if you look at Greenbelt, it's all residential. There's not the industry, there's not the other kinds of ideas about how to create these cities. A second major kind of historical utopianism was done by Le Corbusier, which is the notion of modernism. So Le Corbusier was a founding member of the Congrès International, and kind of took ideas of Taylor. So Taylor was, we'll talk a little bit later about Taylor, but Taylor was a proponent of efficiency in production. And so what modernism does is take some of those ideas of efficiency and apply it to the built form, both at the level of architecture and at the level of city building or urban design. So the emphasis tends to be open floor plans, walls independent of structure. They're generally set in parks, high density developments set in parks with access to transit and freeways. So the kind of infrastructure needed to connect people. And it served in the United States as the basis for a lot of kind of public housing. And so, Le Corbusier says the modern town planning comes to birth with a new architecture. By this immense step in evolution, so brutal and so overwhelming, we burn our bridges and break with the past. Now, the general notion is that you were going to create a new humanity, a new person by doing this. So the third is less well known, but still quite significant in his impact. He's maybe I should correct that. He's incredibly well known as an architect, less well known as an urbanist, but that's Frank Lloyd Wright. And his ideas of Broadacre City, which was a response to Le Corbusier's Radiant City. And so I might note that if you go back here and we look at what this picture is over here, this model, this is his idea of what Paris should look like. His idea is to wipe out Paris, essentially, and replace it with these structures, thereby increasing the density of Paris and making it more rational rather than the kinds of streets that you see off to the side over here. Obviously, anyone who's been to Paris it would be horrified by that idea, but nonetheless, that was his idea, right? And Frank Lloyd Wright reacts against that and proposes that cities ought not to be dense, right? That the dense industrial cities should be replaced with small cities, approximately 10,000, so even less than the Garden City ideas. And that they would just cover the entire United States, and highways would be the connecting tissue, not transit, not railroads, but highways. So very directly kind of feeding into ideas of suburbanization. But he envisioned kind of a self-sufficiency without land rent and landlords, profit, or bureaucracy, which is to say that it was pretty idealistic. And again, a quote that basically suggests that the kind of whole spirit and psyche of humanity could be changed by, in fact, changing the way that they lived and worked and related to each other. Okay, so these ideas all become part of the way we do planning today, but not in the way that the original founders of the ideas envisioned. So utopianism, the planning movements contain elements of utopianism. So they tended to reject historic precedent. They proposed substantial new order. but they failed as visions largely because the social and economic proposals were largely ignored. And they provided kind of the intellectual rationale for a lot of the things that we now think of as potentially problematic: suburbanization, urban highway systems, dense public housing, segregation by use, and the urban renewal system that we had. Um, so basically the goals themselves, the reason that these were being proposed were not carried forward. And the other problem, of course, is that because they didn't really deal with the kind of nuts and bolts of how you get things done, they lacked processes of revision and learning. So there were utopian ideas that were already fixed, and they didn't have any way of evolving in a way that could be incorporated easily into a profession like planning. Okay, so let's that's kind of gets us up to kind of the beginning of planning as a profession, being codified as a profession. And that codification takes place partially by doing planning before there is, in fact, codes for doing planning. So you have New York City regulating tenement housing in a second wave in the early 1900s. Hartford is the first official and permanent local planning board. In 1909 is considered historically important to planning because in Washington, D.C., there was a formation of the first planning association, and there was also the National Conference on City Planning. What's striking about this first conference, it was largely organized by people who had kind of a social perspective of planning, and the funding foundation funding that supported this largely went through those groups. They incorporated the physical determinists as well, it's like Olmsted and people like that. But by the time you get to the second kind of conference, a national conference on city planning, that the funding for that and the control over the conference itself is largely in the hands of the physical planners. And we're going to see this evolution in which social planning is kind of excluded over the 1910s and the 1920s to the point where by the time you get to the Depression, planning is largely about physical planning, and all of the social parts and the public health parts have become their own professions, such as social work and public health. We see Wisconsin, Los Angeles. So Wisconsin, first state to have enabling legislation that permits city to plan. And you also see in 1909, the Harvard School of the Landscape Architecture offering a first course in city planning. So the beginning of thinking about this as an intellectual endeavor and not just a practice. So the city efficient movements, so the idea that tools for planning could be developed, we see a whole host of these. They include kind of Massachusetts being the first to require planning. We see comprehensive zoning ordinances being developed, the American City Planning Institute being created. We also see in 1923, the U.S. Department of Commerce issuing the Standard State Zoning Enabling Act, which then is adopted by most of the states that did not already have planning ordinances. We also see 1926, Euclid versus Ambler Realty Company, which is like the foundational Supreme Court decision around the use of planning to promote public welfare. And in 1920s, we also see the emergence of Robert Moses. So Robert Moses was a planner in New York City, and very much oriented towards infrastructure and particularly highway systems, and much less around urban design per se. And you see kind of planning shifting towards the ideas of Robert Moses rather than Burnham as a leading American planner. And Robert Moses says, well, if the end doesn't justify the means, then what the hell does? It was very much oriented towards trying to push through things that he considered to, in fact, be highly positive changes to the environment, but which over time increasingly gets resistance from people and communities. 1928, you see the U.S. Department of Commerce coming up with the second Enabling Act, this having to do with the Standard City Planning Enabling Act, so the actual profession itself and the acts of planning. And by 1929, you see the first university-based school on city planning at Harvard, and Radburn, New Jersey, the kind of taking Howard's ideas and applying them to neighborhood scale rather than city scale. And also the emergence of the first regional plan, which was done in New York. Depression obviously shook most of this up. And most of what planning was dealing with was growth. There had been substantial growth, obviously, for, since the founding of the country. And within that context, the Depression reverses that. And the problems cease to be problems of growth and become problems of economic dislocation and the lack of capacity. So what planning does is essentially move national during this period of time. Many of these ideas that were being applied to local governments and cities become a basis for thinking about how to get out of the Depression and how to manage it more effectively. And we see a whole host of things we can't really go into in this short presentation, but the National Resource Planning Board that was developed, many of the New Deal economic management tools, the housing and work welfare programs that were developed under the New Deal. You see regional organizations such as the Tennessee Valley Authority getting created. Planning itself, we had an organization of planning professionals, but now we have also an organization of planning officials. So these are people who ran the planning commissions. And then this kind of movement that Harvard started of creating institutions or schools at the universities continues. By the 1952, there were still only 8 planning schools in the United States. So Georgia Tech was the 8th one created, and it was created in 1952. So there wasn't a really large number of schools by that time, but there was a continued sense that universities and in both in terms of methods and in terms of starting to think about what practice looked like would be important places for moving the profession forward. The focus is on physical planning, as I mentioned before, was quite explicit in terms of the way the American Institute of Planners stated its own purpose, where the focus is on as determined by comprehensive arrangements of land use and land occupancy and the regulation thereof. And many of the other ideas around social interventions were kind of lost by this time. So 1950s and 70s, after we've come out of the Depression, largely because of the programs that were put in place, but also because of World War II, we come out in a very different situation. We're back to the problems of growth. And in particular, we see these kind of mass migrations, and there are 3 kinds of migrations that are having a very significant impact. The first was the migration of Blacks out of the South into the North, and largely during World War I and World War II, because of industrial opportunities in those places. And Washington, D.C. becomes the first major city in the United States that has a population that is predominantly minority, and it turns predominantly African American by 1960. So that's the first. It's the problems of race and the kind of issues associated with race that had largely been concentrated in the South now become problems for across the United States, and issues of racism and segregation, all the other issues emerge in other cities as well. The second is the counter movement of northern whites to the Rust Belt and to the Sun Belt, from the Rust Belt, excuse me, to the Sun Belt, largely because of air conditioning, made it much more comfortable to be in these places and enabled economic opportunities and other kinds of things that were not part of the South or the Southwest before. And the third is the inner city, generally whites, to suburban locations, which happened at all major metropolitan areas. And you started seeing cities, in fact, lose population, while at the same time the region growing quite rapidly. This is certainly true of Atlanta. Atlanta went from 500,000 individuals, residents, to about 400,000 residents at its lowest point. Many cities, in fact, had much more significant kind of outmigrations. You start to see new forms of providing housing. So Levitt and what's called Levittown, the idea of taking the efficiencies of mass production and applying it to housing production, the kind of innovative ideas about how to organize the trades themselves, how to organize the supply systems that provided the lumber and the concrete and everything else, applied at a scale that had never been seen before, but marks the kind of the beginning of suburbanization, new patterns of suburbanization, in which very rapid kind of construction techniques were used. You also see the emergence of the national government. So that during the Depression, the national government had in fact been involved in issues of economy and urban issues in a way that it had never done before. And that carries through post-World War II into particular areas of housing and urban renewal. And so you get these kind of redevelopment processes that are tested in the Supreme Court and are seen to be in the public interest, and that those carry forward into the policies of the federal government. You also see kind of a codification of the profession, with modernism taking on a very strong presence as a way of building. And part of the reason that is the reason modernism gets to be the way, such a dominant form, is because of the kind of freestyle plan of the buildings themselves, and the rise of corporations and the need of corporations for spaces that were much more flexible and much larger than the spaces afforded by historic buildings. And so in this context, we see buildings like this, which was a traditional bank building, being torn down and being replaced by buildings like this. And you also started to see, we see this in a number of different locations, where some of those buildings it just very quickly realized that they didn't function the way they needed to function, and tearing them down, demolishing them within a relatively short period of times of being constructed, which is a kind of dramatic sense of the ways in which these buildings were built and why they did not, in fact, serve the purposes that they needed to. Okay, so those are the tensions, new growth, new kind of thing. But there's also, in the planning profession, we've seen a number of planning schools getting formed. One of the newer planning schools got formed after, in the early 1950s, but after the Georgia Tech one, was at the University of Chicago. This planning school lasted only a short period of time. I think it was about 8 to 10 years, if that, but had an enormous impact on the way we think about planning, largely because they developed the ideas and organized their school around these ideas of comprehensive rational planning. So as a planning theory, What that meant is that you had this idea that planning ought to be structured, that it ought to be action-oriented and therefore decision-oriented, and that it seeks to achieve a particular set of desired goals. So we have these ideas of goals, and it tries to achieve them by carefully considering potential consequences of available alternatives or the means. And so it links ends to alternative to means through a process of thinking. And it focuses on the quality of the decision, and it subordinates action to knowledge. So action comes out of knowledge, but it also subordinates knowledge to values. The idea is that you start with the interests, you start with the goals, you then apply knowledge to it about identifying options that work best, and then the action comes out of that. So the planner becomes an expert at being able to do this, at designing for and coping with these kind of complex urban conditions. And so we can think of the structured process as being fairly linear. The idea is you have start with interests and values. You have in the profession scientific knowledge and methods of analytic techniques. And over time, you in a particular planning process, you identify goals, you identify alternatives, you evaluate consequences, you choose alternatives that maximize the goals, and you implement. And then there was a kind of secondary feedback loop in which you evaluate outcomes, and that evaluation leads to new scientific knowledge and new methods and analytic techniques. So planning is seen as an optimization process in which we start with what we desire and we end with actions that lead to what we desire. And so in this context, it runs into a number of problems, which we will talk about. And some of those problems eventually come from the idea that you can separate interests and values from the actual exploration of alternatives, and that they can predate the alternatives. And some of it has to do with the cognitive capacities to actually do this kind of work and flows of information and how methods are actually used. But this comes from University of Chicago. We have individuals who are particularly noted for this work. Tugwell, who actually came out of the New Deal. He was a planner that worked in the Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration, and brings those ideas back into the into a university setting. You have Meyerson and Banfield's politics planning in the public interest. Davidoff will come back when we think about advocacy planning, and Reiner writing about choice theory of planning, which is essentially a rational theory for planning as well. Faludi working on refining and developing these ideas after the kind of wave of criticisms of the initial set of ideas. So we also see, of course, part of the rational models is developing theories about how cities work and building simulation models, other kinds of things, and a great deal of emphasis and work put into developing techniques that continue to this day, through GIS and then ultimately through urban analytics and any number of other kind of transportation models and things like that, which are developed in order to predict behavior and consequences. So why this increase in focus on rationality? Well, one was that social problem solving and using science to solve social problems had seemed to work because of the consequences of coming out of the Depression and World War II. We also had increased kind of emphasis on social and economics as well as physical aspects of urban problems, as people are increasingly seeing that you can't separate these two things as cleanly as the planning profession had been trying to do. And we see the emergence of computing capacity and other kinds of supports for this kind of work. So we have these challenges, of course, to the rational model. The challenges are that of three kinds. One of them says, well, these problems that we're trying to solve are not reducible to rational problems, that they are problems which were labeled as wicked problems, but they're not subject to optimization. The second set of concerns is that knowledge is limited, that the kind of comprehensive cognitive kind of rationality that was being suggested as a model was in fact not possible. And therefore, how we did planning ought not to be based on a model that's not possible. And then the third set of criticisms have to do with the idea that our goals, rational planning tends to say goals are established at the start. Well, singular goals to start off a process suggests that interests are also singular and that there's a common good and a public interest as opposed to multiple interests. And there was a fair amount of criticism that came from the idea that the public interest is a singular thing, and suggested that that emphasis on a public interest was both an oversimplification and led to bias towards elite interests. Okay, so Wicked Problems comes out of Riddle and Weber's book on the dilemmas of a social, well, you really need to see I'm going to move this up. Dilemmas in a General Theory of Planning. This article is the most widely cited planning article ever by a very long shot. It's probably been cited 10 times as much as the next nearest planning article. And that's because it spoke not just to planning, but to a whole series of other professions as well. What it said is that the problems that planners face and the problems of social decision making is that there's no such thing as really as experiments, right? So each attempt to create a solution actually changed the system itself and changed the understanding of the problem. So that the problem definition evolves. It has no clear boundaries. It is, new solutions are actually implemented. They change the nature of the problem itself. So we can think about, for instance, housing and what the housing crisis might be thought about, and it evolves over time. And certainly the kinds of problems we had in the era of the tenements is not the same kind of problems we have now, but the problems we have now are nonetheless just as real. So the characteristics, I'm not going to go through these, we don't have time, you can look at this a little bit later, but the characteristics are kind of no definitive problem formulation, no stopping rules, solutions not being true or false, but good or bad, kind of largely driven by values. There's no possible single set of potential solutions. And the final one, which is the planner has no right to be wrong, meaning this is not a scientific experiment. If you are wrong, if you have policies that move in the wrong direction, you actually hurt people. And so it's a kind of different set of constraints as a result of that. And so we have this idea that knowledge is hard to formulate and formalize. It's contextualized, it's multidisciplinary, and it's organizational. So in this, then, we come to the second idea, which is that knowledge is limited, and the second critique of rational planning. Synoptic rationality is essentially impossible. Procedural rationality is a more attainable goal, and we see emerging ideas about how to have procedural rationality rather than synoptic rationality. And so those are called, come out as theories of incrementalism or mixed scanning. Incrementalism, basically, Charles Lindblom, proponent, he suggests that really the way policy ought to move forward is by making small increments and constantly adjusting your policies in order to adapt to the consequences of the earlier policies. And that over time, you will move into the right direction. So through repetitive attacks on the problem. And what you're trying to do is satisfy, not maximize. There are critiques of this as well, because the argument is that it tends to be quite conservative in terms of the changes that it proposes, because it's only looking for small changes at any point in time. You may not, in fact, address the fundamental issues involved. Etzioni kind of carries this a little further and tries to build a model called mixed scanning, in which he incorporates parts of synoptic rationality with the ideas of incrementalism, and suggests that we start with a kind of wide perspective and kind of choose the most likely options that are most likely fruitful directions to move in. And then we do a much more detailed kind of examination based much more on the kind of rationalism kind of perspectives. So we go from the wide angle to the narrow angle or close up. So then the third set was that interests are plural, and therefore you can't have a single public interest. Comes out in the 1960s, of course, with a very significant kind of set of kind of movements that emerge in the 1960s, in which it becomes really clear that there isn't a single voice, but multiple voices in community, and that particularly marginalized voices are excluded when we talk about a single public interest. And so the planning responses were around advocacy planning and radical planning. And so we kind of can look at this. This is the West End of Boston, and the way in which urban renewal played out in these kinds of cities. A kind of very vibrant, it turned out, community, which was by the city of Boston considered to be a blight. Essentially, urban renewal would wipe that out. You can see the scale of this is enormous, right? How much land was actually cleared. A whole neighborhood was essentially wiped out, and then replaced with these kind of modernist versions of both city government, which is on the upper right, and residential, which clearly wasn't aimed at all for the people that were displaced. And then within the middle of that, Herbert Gonz's book, The Urban Villager, which looked at the West End. He had been living in the West End before the urban renewal and had been doing kind of research as to the kind of social connections that existed in the community, and argued quite forcefully that this was not a community that was full of blight, but rather a community that was quite vibrant, and appropriate for lower income individuals, and providing housing for lower income individuals, and critiqued the urban renewal process. You also see Jane Jacobs' work emerging at this time. Her opposition is, or her work is on many different scales. The issue of what constituted a vibrant city, but also her direct opposition to the work of Robert Moses, and the particular proposal for cross Manhattan arterial roads, highways that were going to cut right through Manhattan. And so there was a social movement, a kind of very clear social movement around that. Advocacy planning emerges as a way of response to this, and Paul Davidoff, who we saw before in choice theory, comes back with advocacy and pluralism in planning, with an article around a proposal for the development of what he called advocate planners. I might note that Paul Davidoff was a practitioner. I mean, he was not a university or academic. And so these ideas are emerging out of people in practice as well. So you basically the model was kind of like the advocacy lawyer model, in which planners would represent and plead for the plans of the many interest groups. So planners would work with multiple interest groups, different planners, and then there would be a process which was never defined, in which planners would come together and basically argue for the interest of their particular group, and through a process that either was like court or through a bargaining process, you would come up with a citywide plan. But that the marginalized interests would in fact have voice within that process. Radical planning went even further. That were structural critiques of the legitimacy of political and economic power structures. The kind of best known from that era would have been Kraushaar's outside the whale. And the analogy is that we all live inside the whale. We don't actually know what the whale is like unless we leave the whale and look at it. And he was arguing that that's in fact what planners should do, is help people to see that they live in a particular place with particular conditions to change those conditions. So in practice, that got kind of empowered through community organizing. And so Saul Alinsky, for instance, Rules for Radicals, other books that he wrote, and his organizational work and the development of citizen organizations creates a counter pressure to kind of traditional notions of planning by saying that this is embedded in community and rises up from the grassroots. Okay, so we then get into another set of traditions. We start, we've seen the rise of citizen organization. We've seen the increased emphasis on diversity of voice in planning, the kind of challenges that has to rational planning. And we also see these kinds of actions that look like this. It's these very large demonstrations around feminism, civil rights, environment, kind of working against nuclear warfare and other kinds of Vietnam peace movements. All of those in the 1960s are significantly larger than anything we had seen before, and challenge the kind of ideas of what it means to be planning and the governance systems that we work in. So the national responses had to do with the Great Society programs and Nixon's work to promote environmental protection, which was people kind of forget that much of the kind of basic environmental acts came out while Nixon was president. And we also start to see kind of the emergence of what we call a postmodern critique, as a critique of modernism that underlaid the urban kind of urban renewal. And arguments that knowledge is not objective but socially constructed, and that the modernist planning's premise of kind of a unified idea of liberation, that everybody will be freed the same way, leads to processes of domination rather than to liberation, and arguments about how to, in fact, move forward from that. You also see the emergence of more nuanced ways of thinking about what the relationship is between knowledge and outcomes, in which social learning is an essential feature. So you have Argyris and Schoen's work in A Stable State and other kinds of books in which they argue that kind of evaluative functions, where you look at outcomes and consequences and then you just simply think about the action strategy, are what we call single loop learning, but keep us trapped in the assumptions that underlie all of the process. And that what we needed is what was called double loop learning, where we went back to our reasoning for why we thought that the systems should be the way they were, and look at the underlying assumptions as part of any evaluative function. Any learning society has to be able to do that and propose structures for how those learning societies would work. We have John Friedman's work on transactive planning and kind of this notion of face-to-face engagement with people, citizen participation gaining a much clearer foundation. We see Sherry Arnstein's A Ladder of Citizen Participation. And this, by the way, is the second most cited article in planning literature. And this is not so much theoretical as an argument for the level of participation that ought to be seen as desirable, and classifying different kinds of participatory processes as ranging from being manipulative or essentially just therapy to levels of citizen control, and an argument for moving up the ladder. We see John Friedman's work in the early 1980s of starting to translate work that was happening in Europe. Jürgen Habermas, his work on communicative rationality, being brought into the planning tradition, and kind of arguing that fundamentally what planning should be doing is helping communities do 4 types of action, which are necessary for what Habermas thought of as communicative rationality. That is, that people have to be able to understand each other, that whether it's local knowledge or expert knowledge, they have to be able to understand each other. They have to be able to work around development of shared values. They have to understand what's truthful and what's not, and they have to be able to build trust. And in order to create a new understanding, you have to be able to do all 4 of those things. And so there's a communicative turn in planning where you see Forrester, Healy, Judith Innes, Larry Susskind, any number of other people developing techniques for kind of mobilizing the creative and the empowerment within the community itself. This kind of communicative rationality leads to the development of much more robust systems of citizen participation, but also to mediation and other kinds of kind of practices that come into planning. The emphasis is on transparency, inclusivity, and truth-seeking. And then particular processes like this one by Larry Susskind, about how you would think about planning, building on the communicative rationality, but also building on the work of Davidoff, of Kent, Altschuler, Lindblom, as kind of theoretical foundations for a new way of thinking about planning. We have 15 more minutes, I guess. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Let's see. I'll take maybe 7 of it. We may not be completely finished by then, but and then kind of open up to see what the questions are. So you have new federalism. So what you had is the notion of new federalism is a replacement for the original federalism. This is a national government, in fact, expands greatly during the 1960s and 70s. The Reagan Revolution is a push back against that in trying to return to quote unquote local control or state control, many of the things that the federal government had taken on. And so the new federalism is an effort by, particularly during the 1980s, but it actually started under Nixon very quickly after Johnson's kind of changes, but around trying to reduce federal domestic spending, privatizing many of the functions of the federal government and the state governments had taken on, creating stronger property rights and deregulation. And so under those particular pressures, you see a lot of changes, right? And we're again not going to go through all the changes, except to say that the big picture is that we move from government providing services and in regulating and things like that to incentivizing private individuals to and corporations to provide public goods. And probably the Hope 6 is the best example of that. A great deal of discouragement around public housing and the way that it had been built, which was largely through these modernist public housing projects, which tended to, over time, concentrate poverty and distress in those communities. The original ideas of public housing included ideas of social services and economic and other kinds of services. By and large, those social services eventually get defunded. I mean, they're just not part of it. And so the kind of concentration of poverty without any supports becomes increasingly problematic. And the idea is to basically tear all that down and to build mixed income communities in which some of the original residents would be able to be housed there in essentially what is a private market. We see other models like the Enterprise Zone Empowerment Community Acts and things like that that use tax incentives and credits and wage credits and things like that in order to accomplish what urban renewal tried to accomplish before through direct government intervention. You also see a significant increase during this period of time, of planning. You essentially kind of see the emergence of the AIP has an exam for membership. It started the certified planners get developed. The Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning is formed and is established as a branch. And you see the emergence of the accreditation system. So again, more professionalization of the field itself, both within the field through certification and within higher education. You also see the Journal of Education and Planning getting started, which was a journal that was within the academy. And so the American Planning Association Journal wasn't the only journal then that was doing planning research. Other like pragmatism emerged, or kind of increasing sense of how planning is related to politics and what the limits of the kind of political contextual limits are of planning, how to think about those. And then we get finally to these ideas of, well, what motivated all of this? So, we have these core values in planning. We're forward thinking. We link knowledge to action through goals. How do we think about those? So some of this is about, planning being value driven, ideas of sustainability and resilience as being central, healthy and prosperous communities. The core values are also that we're embedded in community diversity and engagement. And that challenges democratic engagement, transparency, issues of equity and social justice. And the final thing I wanted to point out is, well, first of all, I guess I have a question for you. And let's just see if anybody can answer this. It says, all of the following are known for their involvement in organizational approaches to citizen participation, except one of these. Who is that person? Anybody know?
Is it B?
It is B. You win. You don't have to take the exam. Excuse you. So, but yes, it is B. So Saul Alinsky was, we mentioned, was related to organizational citizen participation. Susan Arnstein did the citizen participation ladder. David Off did the advocacy planning. Geddes is from an earlier era in which planners were thought of as experts and was a lead planner in US history. The last thing is that there's resources available to you. And I would say these two are probably the most basic. There's a book published in 2002, but is still quite useful. That was specifically aimed at helping practitioners understand planning theory. And it's, compared to planning theory books, generally quite readable and quite thin, I might note also. So certainly you should be reading that. And then the best history book, we don't really have a great history book, but this is probably the best. It's still idiosyncratic as to what it covers, is the American City Planning since 1890 that Mel Scott put together. There's also a bunch of other resources. You can look at the 100 essential planning books. You're never going to read all 100 of them, but it's interesting to see what's on that list and in terms of planning ideas and things like that. And so these are all examples of that are on the varying lists. And then there are selected planning firsts that you probably should be familiar with, which you can get partially from the history, but just being aware of what the kind of historic precedents are within planning. And then APA itself has a history. Be useful to understand what that is. And that is it. So, what do we have for questions?
I don't have any questions in the chat yet, but if anybody does have any questions, please feel free to ask them either in the chat or just unmute yourselves and ask directly. I do see one hand raised, but now it's gone. Does anybody have any questions?
I realize that, trying to cover all of that is pretty overwhelming, but but anyway, if you go ahead.
Is it possible to see to get like similar past questions that you shared with us, like a series of questions that can, that we can just look at or practice on?
Oh, actually, I don't have a series of questions. That would have to come from GPA. I don't know if they have any for kind of examples. There are, Beth, do you want to talk about supports? Because there are.
I will ask Christina, who is the GPA PDO contact. I will ask her about that, and if there are some sample questions or tests available or what those resources are, we will certainly get those out to the group. This particular session, the PowerPoint and the recording will be available on the GPA website either later today or early next week, depending on how quickly that gets posted. But that will go out and be available to you as a resource as well.
Yeah, and so and also APA's has resources on taking the exam.
Yes.
So those are quite helpful as well.
Yes.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Will you be able to send us the link of the presentation and the recording of this session?
Yes, once it's posted, we will notify everyone that it has been posted.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, I skipped a lot of what was on the slides. So it's helpful to actually look at the slides and see what else, some more details that were there. It's like drinking from a fire hydrant. It's not easy. There's a lot covered in a very short period of time. I will say this about the history and theory. I mean, it's part of the taking of the exam, of course, is that there different sections have different percentiles in terms of their impact on the overall score. And history and theory are not the biggest by a long shot. It's there's there, but you have to understand generally how this all works right? And the other piece of it is that understanding the history and theory can help you understand other things like the questions on ethics or other pieces which are closely linked to the way the profession develops and what the challenges were and how planners really thought about that practice.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Elliott. There are lots of thank yous from the participants in the chat as well, and comments about how great the lecture was, and everyone's looking forward to having the recording and the PowerPoints to review. I did want to remind everybody of the next session on leadership is going to be held next Wednesday from 2 to 3:30 p.m. And a reminder will be sent out on Wednesday morning for that as well. So thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time.
And good luck with the exam.
Yes, good luck. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.